All right, another edition of Jay's Analysis. This time I have a longtime friend of mine, a guy that I've had a lot of debates with, a lot of discussions with, who's had quite an influence on my thinking from his thought process, James Kelley. James is an author. We're going to be talking about some of his books, what he's writing in the future, or what his plans are, that is. So, James, why don't you tell us first about yourself and your background and what caused you to get into the stuff that you're into?
Yeah, thanks for having me, by the way, Jay. Good to be here. I studied history and English lit for undergrad. At that time, I was interested in the religious and philosophical background to English Romanticism. So that got me acquainted with Gnosticism and also some of the odd religious currents in the 19th century. For grad school, I studied Western esotericism in the context of the history of science.
Right.
I didn't finish a degree because I decided to simply expand my first grad school research project into a book, and that became Anatomyzing Divinity.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I thought that a lot of what you discussed in that book was fascinating. But now, you weren't influenced by Dr. Joseph Farrell, right?
Yes, I was. The way that it actually panned out was I did my undergraduate, and then I was a musician at the time, so I kind of had a hiatus with my education, did the music thing for several years. But during that time, I got in a circle, got involved with a couple people who had been parishioners in Joseph P. Farrell, also known as Bishop Photius Farrell, in They were parishioners in his church that he had in Tulsa. And for those that don't know, it was the Holy Orthodox Church in North America, which is not recognized as Orthodox or as a legitimate jurisdiction by many people, including my own Orthodox jurisdiction, ROKOR, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, or the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, which is what I'm involved in. So, controversial guy. But I heard about his writings from these parishioners that had been under him, and so I read his works, and that was my introduction to Eastern Orthodox theology. So before then, I was very unsophisticated with my theological purview. I grew up Protestant, a Church of Christ, and there just wasn't there wasn't a lot of reading going on there as far as theology and stuff. So I did get into the Church Fathers. I was handed a copy of Henry Bettinson's early Church Fathers.
Yeah. And
basically, after reading that, after getting to St. Athanasius, I was pretty much like, take me down there, you know.
Right.
And that was pretty much it. There's never been any wavering as far as since then. Although there's always growth. Always growing to do.
Well, so wait a minute. Let's back up a little bit. You were talking about history of English literature and Gnosticism. How did you make that connection there? What was the what did you start seeing when you're looking at the history of English lit that led you to look at something like Gnosticism?
Yeah, the reason why I got into English lit was basically, I wanted to look at ideas, history of ideas, and I saw there were some really great books that I read. I was lucky enough to read some literary criticism right off the bat that was really expansive. It was really good. The guy named Meyer H. Abrams, I think is his name, wrote a book called Natural Supernaturalism. It's about the English Romantics, and it kind of looks in a very sophisticated way at the ideas behind Wordsworth, Coleridge, where they got their ideas from. Of course, Coleridge got a lot of his ideas from Schelling, and Schelling got a lot of his ideas from Jakob Boehme. And Boehme, in turn, was influenced by Paracelsus,
right.
Kabbalah, all this kind of theosophical.
Right.
Some people think that he came up with the word theosophical. Some people think he was the first person to use that term. So I just kind of started to trace things back, but I didn't get quite that far back in the chain of influences at that point. I simply looked and saw, wow, Blake seems to have this view of the world that begins with a golden age, and then there's this kind of cosmic fall, and then everything, kind of swirls into this ascent. And I was like, and then Abrams also talks about Plotinus, so I was familiar with Gnosticism vaguely, and also Neoplatonism a bit.
Right.
So I was interested in, there was a lot more behind these poems in this literature than I saw at first glance. So it got me kind of interested in ideas, and I just drifted more and more and more into, away from reading the novels and poems, and more just into looking at the history of ideas.
But now I understand that where you are is also a hub for the philosophy of science. You had training and began to look at the philosophy of science historically correct too, right?
Yeah. I at the University of Oklahoma, I'm in Norman, Oklahoma. They've got a program that's considered the top program in the world by some people, even above Cambridge and all these other. And now you know as well as I do, a lot of times they do those rankings based on the number of publications of the people, the number of books by major academic presses that are put out by the faculty, the number of faculty per student. So you don't necessarily have household names. Well, hey, let's face it, there aren't any household names in the history of science.
Right.
But they have some of the best people there, and they have a great collection. The great thing about their history of science collection here at Norman is, unlike most collections of its type, they will let anybody in there with that simply wants to look at the materials. Most research facilities like that have special collections, you have to have a letter of permission, or you have to have some indication of what you're going to do in there, like is it going to result in an article or a book? If not, then you'll probably be denied access.
Now wait a minute. Now I know the answer to this, but how do you get from English lit and then history of ideas and Paracelsus and Renaissance type esotericism to what we think of as science or the philosophy of science? Because in our day, most people think of something like literature as something right brain, science as something that's left brain and supposedly only based on logic and analytical reasoning. How do you bridge this gap? How does that lead to philosophy of science?
Right. Well, I've always focused on medieval and earlier. That's always at least where I start. And back then, you didn't have science; you had natural philosophy.
Right.
And natural philosophy, you can define it many different ways, but it includes what we would call experimental science, empiricism, all of those things. But it also includes cosmology. It also includes, philosophy and even theology.
Right.
They're all, as you know, the 7 liberal arts, they're all a chain. And that holistic view of knowledge is always where I started from, because those were the sources in the time period that I inhabited, if you will. So I always started from there, and I was interested in the 19th century, especially how science becomes very, the rise of positivism, Auguste Comte,
right,
and those guys. The fact that becomes something that circles back and affects literature, it affects politics, and by the time you get to the late 1800s, you have some really crazy things going on in Germany, as we all know. All these literary and scientific, if you want to look at positivism and Darwinism, in terms of science, they all kind of start to meld together.
Yes.
And it becomes apparent, if it wasn't before the late 1800s, it becomes glaringly apparent that there are a lot of theological ideas that are at the core of Darwinism. And Darwinism is science. I mean, you can't hold your head up and say you're not a Darwinist and get anywhere in academia.
Oh, I know it. I mean, I just did a lengthy discussion of my own just on the fact that Darwinism is really just an entire worldview, especially if you look at somebody like Teilhard de Chardin. I mean, it's not a foremost paleontologist and Darwinist of the last century. It's very evident that he has an entire philosophical worldview at work, not just a sort of, empirical, fact-based list of observations that he's made. In fact, he's promoting an entire schema that that includes things far beyond mere observation, is what I'm trying to say.
For instance, I agree with you completely. There's a scholar named Lawrence Birkin whose work that I absolutely love. He had a book called Hitler as Philosoph, which is not what it sounds like. He's a Jewish scholar. He's not trying to take up for Hitler. He's trying to say, let's take his ideas seriously, because if we don't, this will recur. That kind of a thing. So he has a book called Hitler as Philosoph, and he has another book called Consuming Desire. And really, what he does in Consuming Desire in a few articles is he looks at Darwin, and he says, Charles Darwin basically believed that there was a kind of, because he believed everything began with an amoeba.
Right.
He had this view of the development of life, which said, well, there was a unisex at one point. There was just one single sex.
Right.
And somehow it split into two at some undisclosed point. But he said at the beginning of everything, he said that the amoeba was a full-body erogenous zone. It was nothing but a desiring. That was the only function and the only energy that it exerted, was a kind of erotic desire toward anything exterior to itself. Now,
well, this sounds like Plato.
Exactly. And somehow it split off, and then he gets into his Victorian views that, well, mankind is more developed and more evolved than women because they're more differentiated from that norm, from that amoebic ancestor. It's an all-desiring, all-emotional thing. So the woman is closer to the all-desiring amoeba that's controlled by her hysterical emotions. So there's a lot of stuff that's bound up into Darwin. And some people would just humbug that and say, well, we can just ballast all that and just keep the part that we know works. Well, it doesn't work that way.
Right, it doesn't work that way. Yeah, no, in fact, I just read an essay that was discussing Plato's, it was discussing the connection between Orphism, the Orphic mysteries, and the influence on Plato, and how Plato sort of made or took some of the Orphic mysteries and turned them into kind of parables for metaphysical truths. And one of those metaphysical truths was the relationship of Eros. And of course, we know in Plato, the relationship of Eros and desiring to, man's desire to eventually attain the one again. And then on top of that was the issue of multiplicity coming from the one and then returning to the one. Point being that what you're describing in terms of the early primeval amoeba and all of these all this metaphysical baggage that's being tacked onto it actually sounds a lot more like some sort of ancient metaphysical mythology than it does something that's a purely fact-based science. Now, of course, modern 20th century Darwinian theorists would like to claim that that's no longer true when you look at things like the Darwinian synthesis of the 20th century and how supposedly they attempted to drop some of the metaphysical baggage, but that actually is not true. It still retains all the same metaphysical baggage, but not that this discussion wasn't necessarily intended to go down that route, but it just made me think of what I've been reading recently.
Yeah, and just as a closing point, I have a friend at the University of Oklahoma who wrote a book, Victorian Detective Fiction, I think is the name of it. Dr. Frank up there, and in I was thumbing through it the other day, and he mentioned offhand that Darwin always carried in his pocket throughout his whole Beagle journey Milton's Paradise Lost. And let us not forget that Milton was amazingly influenced by dualistic thinking.
Absolutely.
He was overwhelmingly burdened. He blanched beneath this burden of an almost Manichaean view of the cosmos and the view of theology. Also Tyndall. A lot of people don't realize the King James Bible was mainly done by Tyndall, and then it was later touched up and changed and crafted more. by, the people under King James, the Anglican bishops of the time in
right.
the 17th century. But Tyndall specifically cited texts that many scholars have identified as Bogomil texts. And for those that don't know, the Bogomils were dualistic. They're basically like Cathars. A lot of times they're lumped together with the Cathars in southern France, who believed that matter was rancid, filth, dirty stink, and that it was they were Docetists basically. They didn't believe that there was a real crucifixion, and they had their saints would starve themselves to death often, and that would be considered a triumph of their theology when one of their saints would be able to go on hunger strike and starve themselves to death. But,
why weren't you led down that kind of a path? Why did you go to Eastern Orthodoxy and not a church like that?
Well, I've always had a sense of the Scripture of having a very, very pious mother who made me read my Bible every day.
I know, I'm kidding, but that doesn't.
No, but honestly, in the Scripture we do see, and then when you get to the Church Fathers, it's just blatantly obvious that, the correct theology has to be world affirming.
Sure.
The world was made very good. And that's a major part of, we failed to go into the fact that before I did Anatomyzing Divinity, I was able to get out a short theological book, Realism and Glory.
Uh-huh.
And in that, the main point that I was trying to focus on in that book was that there's a kind of different concept of perfection in Eastern Orthodox theology than in the West, I think.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
Just briefly, I coined a term for it, which it's an ancient concept, it's nothing new, but it's that creation is perfective as opposed to imperfect, defective, or perfect. And it's created, not at the acme of perfection, but it's created able to take on more and more perfection, that perfection being the very life and energies of God. That's completely alien to the West.
It is, right.
Yeah, it's you have a different set of philosophical blinders that are put on, or filters, that kind of make that idea just incomprehensible.
Yeah, in the Western view, because of, as you know, different theological and philosophical presuppositions, there's a kind of dialectical opposition that sort of runs between all the thinkers in the West, particularly with Augustine. And so the idea is that if something is perfect, then its dialectical opposite by which it would be defined as imperfect. And so if creation, in the early stages or at the beginning, is defined as imperfect because it's on its journey to something more grand or better or whatever, then it's in some way defective or not good. But as you and I know, that the Eastern view is much more amenable to the idea of there being many goods rather than there being one, monadic, absolutely simple good that's sort of unattainable in this world.
Absolutely. I would sign on to all that.
So, but this is a good question, or this leads to the next question, a good segue. So you got into reading Eastern stuff, and that led you not to choose Latin Christianity. So tell me what, in a simple way, in a easy way, what were the main reasons that you didn't choose Roman Catholicism?
Yes, well, it's kind of one of those issues and one of those problems that just loom large in the life of any Orthodox, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're always told, well, this is kind of like Catholicism for the Eastern Europe, which it's certainly not. It's extremely hard to get anyone to understand the division between the Eastern Church, the Orthodox, and the Roman Catholic Church, the Latin Church. The reason why? Because you can't just simply go back to history and say, well, this happened here. You have to provide a framework for understanding what all those facts mean. And what makes things difficult is the history books that have been written out of the European university system, which influenced the American university system.
Right.
They're all already on track with this Latin-oriented historiography, whether it's Protestant or Catholic.
Right.
So it's extremely hard to get people back to that point and to say, see, you should look at the facts in this light.
Mm-hmm.
But it's multifaceted. There are many different ways of looking at it, but perhaps the best way, or at least the one that I'm thinking about the most today, is what's called the papal claims. What you have is in the 10th century, or actually 11th century, 1040s. You have the accession to the papal throne of a Pope, Leo,
Mm-hmm.
who was the cousin of the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry, and who had learned in the Rhineland, where he came from, he had learned that monasteries could throw off all external influence of secular power and become completely self-sufficient and self-determining. The monasteries at Cluny and other ones around there in the Rhineland had already done this. There were feudal lords who could not come anywhere near those monasteries, and the thing is they started creating networks. Cluny had like 560, I think, sister monasteries underneath its aegis within the century of its being founded. So there was this big, huge power structure that was facing, it was putting itself up against the secular power and saying, we're not going to be dominated by you anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That's all fine and good. But what happens is one of those guys becomes Pope, one of the guys that was influenced, Leo.
Right.
And once he gets in the papal office in 1046, he turns everything on its head and starts saying things that have never been said before. One of his successors, the Georgian Reform, is named after him, Gregory VII. There was a collection of precepts that were appended to his correspondence in the Vatican. And they were a list of principles of the papal claims, what they were saying about the papacy, the Pope, that was new. Because one scholar said, well, they didn't have any precedent in canon law, so they had to make some things up. Well, one of the things that they made up is it said no one can depose the vicar of Christ, that's the Pope,
Mm-hmm.
but he can depose anyone else, including an emperor. And it also said that he can make canon law as he sees fit, and it's infallible by that very fact.
Sure.
Now, Gregory VII himself, he even made some strange comments at one point that said that he was some kind of reincarnation or avatar of Peter, of St. Peter. So you have things that are being said that are in no way compatible with the way that ecclesiology has been viewed anywhere before then, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
The Eastern Church, it was just a collision course with the Eastern Church because they're like, well, we're just going to overlook these boasts, and just consider them to be, not serious. But in the 11th century, you have the split between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics
Right.
over this papal issue, basically. I mean, yes, it was the papal legate Humbert excommunicated
Yeah.
the emperor and also the patriarch, and there was in kind, the mutual, there was the favor was returned.
Right.
But I think at that point, the reason why we can say there's a break is because there's a completely different ecclesiology, which makes the Pope into a kind of imperial figure that takes on all the kind of accoutrements of a Western emperor. And that leads us to the Franks. One of my favorite subjects.
Yeah, well, let me ask you this, just things that pop into my head, because this was obviously a big issue for me in the past in my journey. You have popes prior to that making a lot of statements that probably lead later generations of popes to come to those conclusions. In other words, you have things like, Gregory the Great making statements, other popes as well. You look at the Acacian Schism and how that was healed. So I'm not saying that you're wrong. I'm just saying that
you deal with those facts. Yeah.
In other words, it's almost as if sort of implicit. I don't want to say necessarily that Rome was always wrong, because I know that in the Eastern view of things, there were a lot of popes that were saints. But I guess what I'm getting at is, if that view were correct, why would there have ever even been councils? Do you see what I mean? Why wouldn't the Pope have just, settled all disputes by signing some document? Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, in other words, from the Roman view, the argument is often made that if you look at the letters of Pope Clement early on, Clement supposedly solves a bunch of disputes in the Corinthian church by merely writing a letter. And the point I'm getting at is, why would the Eastern Church have gone to all the trouble to having all these imperial summoned councils when any of these issues could have just been easily solved by a single papal letter? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think that ultimately, if you do arguments from history, then what ends up happening, which I think people have to do, you have to get back to history. But if you see certain popes, like Gregory the Great, who seem to say anyone can appeal to the Pope at any time, and if it's important, you really should appeal to the Pope.
Right.
All of these things happen. And then if you look from the Eastern side, you're like, yeah, well, all of the fathers of the Christian church in the early centuries, all the Greek-speaking church fathers, which are the majority of them, many were bishops, and if you look at the way they behaved as bishops, then conciliarity seems to be the norm. I mean, it's not, you don't see anything like what the papal claims are saying. Now, if someone wanted to play devil's advocate, they could say, yeah, well, none of this is decisive, because there could have been the true theology that was held by the Pope, and other people just simply didn't appreciate or internal full implications of the papal claims.
Well, let me ask you this. I'm sorry, go ahead. I thought you were done. Go ahead.
Oh, no. And basically what I was just going to say is that the reason why I started with Leo in 1046 is because, a lot of people before, but Leo's the first pope that said, I'm going to start an international offensive program to start trying to subjugate all of these churches, many of which were thoroughly enmeshed in the feudal system, like in Germany.
Right.
All the major prelates were all feudal vassals of Leo's lords, one of whom was the Holy Roman Empire.
Right.
So for Leo to say, I'm taking over, it was, whether he liked it or not, it was a secular thing. It was like saying, I'm going to secularize your national church and take it over. And he also started the College of Cardinals. He didn't start it, but it was there, but they had a mainly liturgical function, so I've read, until the 1040s or thereabout, when they became kind of, what they are today, a group that elects the Pope,
sure,
and a group that upholds and creates policy. And it's, one scholar said it's almost like a reinstitution of the Roman Senate,
right,
but under a papal monarchy.
Right, absolutely.
But go ahead.
No, that's a great definition or explanation of the term that I've seen you write about and talk about, the Franco-Papal Monarchy. Here's a good question, though, which I think I know where you're going to go, but do you see a connection between the Western views of Augustine that we see sort of blending with Plotinus and what we call Neoplatonism or Middle Platonism or just Platonism, whatever we want to call it? Do you see that theological wellspring that comes out of Augustine in any way leading to the actual ecclesiology or praxis of the church in the West that becomes the Franco-Papal monarchy?
Yes, I mean, I think that Augustine's theology, now keep in mind, I'm not doubting the sanctity of Blessed Augustine. And I also, in my, middle years here, I hope they're my middle years, I've become a lot less sharp in my comments because Augustine is a ecclesiastical writer that's respected all over the world, even by many Orthodox. But I do think that his errors have to be dispassionately discussed. So that, because it's so important, because the basic fact is that I would like for people to understand, because it completely changes the way you think about everything, is that the West, in my opinion, is based on Augustine's theology. It's based on all of his major pivot points of his thinking.
Right.
All the major segments of what he thinks are important get jammed into every single person that is writing about theology in the West, whether they know it or not, when he lived.
Right.
Which he died in the early 5th century, but AD. But with Augustine, there's so many different ways you could approach it, as far as, well, exactly what did Augustine say, and what did he give to the West that was important? Well, I like to start with Augustine. I like to start with a place I normally don't go, which is his theory of images and knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Augustine in the Trinitate put forth the idea that the lowest form of knowledge is a kind of emblem, a kind of visual symbol or emblem that actually physically comes into existence in order to communicate an idea to someone, almost like a rebus. What do you call those books that have little pictures instead of words? It's like that.
Yeah.
But then above that, the higher level of knowledge would be pure concepts or ideas.
Playboy?
That are
a Playboy? Sorry. Go ahead. I was making a joke.
Oh.
Actually, I guess Playboy has words, but no, I'm sorry. You're making go ahead.
Hey, Augustine is hilarious. I mean, I
know
laugh
he is,
all
right?
day long about Augustinian theology. It's hilarious. No, I'm just kidding. But
well, I was trapped in this for 10 years, so I know. I mean, you had a big influence on getting me to question a lot of those assumptions. So that's why I find this to be hilarious at the same time, just kind of from a meta perspective. I mean, I'm talking to the guy who, in a lot of ways, influenced me to drop a lot of these, or more so to question them. So we know when you and I were arguing this stuff a few years ago, that was sort of me, working my way through this stuff, because I never.
Oh yeah.
I mean, if you're a Western Christian and you didn't go the track of reading Eastern theology, just like you said, it doesn't ever occur to you to question, the Augustinian view. I mean, if you, when I got my church fathers set, I just immediately started in on reading Latin church fathers, and so I read. When I was reading through De Trinitate, you just sort of take it as, oh, okay, well, this is the magnum opus of the first great Trinitarian synthesis, right? It just doesn't occur to you to question those things. So I apologize, I didn't mean to interrupt with all that. But so go back to the Augustinian view of the emblems of knowledge.
Yeah, the emblems of knowledge are the lowest form.
Right.
The higher than that would be pure forms, and he means Platonic forms.
Right.
Plotinus, Porphyry, and all those guys have different versions of it. But he would think that there's a realm of forms, and there's a great book by Philip Carey about, I forget the title of it. He's written several books about Augustine, which I like them. And he talks about how Augustine came up with this idea of inner space, inner psychological. It may be anachronistic to call it psychological, but it's kind of the roots of modern psychology, I think. It's the idea that basically, because they don't have the therapeutic cure of the heart, which is the original Christian teaching, I would argue, they have to do something. So what they do is they go through these inner journeys of images.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is, by the way, above the realm of forms, which is the higher knowledge, you have the essence of God.
Right.
And with Augustine's view of beatific knowledge, he would believe that one could ascend and know all the things of God, as he says in one of his writings. Now, even Thomas Aquinas and the scholastics had to do something with this idea. They had to struggle with, well, how can we actually be united with the essence of God? And that's where they come up with the supernatural grace and some of the other intermediary realms.
Right.
In order to keep people from saying, well, yes, we follow Augustine, but we don't believe that individuals are merged with the one. That sounds kind of like Eastern, Far Eastern stuff.
Right. Well, and even Augustine in De Trinitate talks about created love, and so when Aquinas deals with this in his theology, he speaks frequently of created grace, but that applies as well to what you're talking about with knowledge, because for Augustine has what we might call, I guess, an illuminary view of, or a more a Platonic view of epistemology, in that one has to, like you said, travel through these images back to the one, or to the divine essence, wherein the forms are ultimately for him located.
Mm-hmm. And where Augustine gets into trouble, I think, is when he uses his theory of images, which I think he got right out of pagan philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
He uses this theory of images in order to explicate the Old Testament, and that's when things start going haywire.
Right.
He says that the burning bush is an angelophany, or he doesn't use that term, that's Alexander Golitsyn's term, but he says that an angel allows the Holy Trinity to be present in the emblem for the purposes of a lesson that's taught to the onlooker. And basically this just doesn't work at all, because for all the earlier church fathers in the Eastern tradition and Western tradition, the early Latins say it is too, the Old Testament theophanies, including the burning bush, are the presence of the glory of God.
Right.
The presence of Christ, disincarnate Christ that's there. And even the Arians believe that. That's what Father John Romanides kind of, in his wonderful way of telling someone they're wrong and making them feel really, really bad about it. He shows in one of his articles that the Arians and the Chalcedonian Orthodox agreed against Augustine that the Old Testament theophanies were actually the presence of the disincarnate Christ, and all the energies of God were there. But Augustine disagrees with this, because in my opinion, he's once again, just like Milton's, blanching under the pressure of this bad theology. Well, I think Augustine, who was a former Manichaean,
right,
and went through all these phases of Ciceronian thought and then Platonian thought, he's trying to fit everything together, believing, I think rightly, that there's one knowledge.
Right.
But I think that he's trying to make it fit intellectually, whereas the tradition of the church fathers is that they experience God, and from that experience, they craft poetic, indications about types of therapy and experience that will lead somebody else to that. And that's really refreshing the first time to hear that kind of approach to theology. As a former Protestant person that looked at everything as, well, now we're sitting in church and we're bored,
mm-hmm.
and then later we can read some philosophy and it's more engaging. Eastern Orthodoxy is completely different from that, because it says that everything is based on the fact that we have this therapeutic cure. Here are these success stories, these hundreds of volumes of saints' lives, and you can be put under a spiritual father, and you can get on the track to being on a cure as well. And that's not what I got from my Protestant upbringing at all.
Right.
Even though I did get many good things from them, though.
Yeah. One thing that comes to my mind from my own experience is just that, and although I'm not technically, I'm not Eastern Orthodox, I understand what you're getting at. In my experience, something that eventually became odd was that in Latin theology, it is part of the theology that you can read, the entire Summa, and you can understand it and not be of the faith, right?
Yeah.
So, which is odd, because by definition, how if you didn't believe the thing, how could you truly understand the thing?
Sure. Well, that's how you get, people like, not to pick on non-Orthodox at all, but, because you have these bad examples in Orthodoxy too, but you have people like Hans Kung and other people like that spend, 25 years in graduate education, postgraduate doctorates from universities all over the world, and at the end of the day, they don't come up with anything that's really compelling. It's just really bad stuff. It's stuff that by any definition just has very little worth. It's really arid, it's really sentimental, and it's almost like someone read the existentialist philosophers of the early last century and then tried to cram it into some outworn ideas that aren't even valid in Christian history. It's like they're taking the signifiers of Christian theology. Oh, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Trinity, all of the other nice things we like to talk about, and they're just kind of running them through a meat grinder of whatever the latest theological trend is. And it's really,
the fad, right?
Yeah, but I've learned a lot though from other Catholic theologians too. Though Jean Danelou and others have written fantastic stuff, but I wouldn't go with them on their opinions on certain things. It's just it's just not an all or nothing thing. Thankfully, we can read what we want.
So here we go. Here's the next question. How do we get from all this and what you call the Augustino-Platonic tradition and what you talk about, maybe you can define and explain the Latin shield, to a book on alchemy?
Yeah, well, the Augustino-Platonic tradition, I use that term to indicate basically Western theology, but also the cultural and philosophical movements that come, with modernity and the early modern period. They're all, as we intimated before, they're all decisively affected by Augustine.
Right.
In fact, if you look at the Renaissance view of the image and the kind of international politics that are going on in the 1600s and 1700s, I've just recently come to the conclusion that the image theory of Augustine, the emblematic theory, was extremely influential on espionage at the time. We'll get to that later, I know, but to answer this question, the Augustino-Platonic tradition is the West. It's the West's whole cultural history and all its different manifestations. And then also, what was the second part of the question?
Well, you go from that to the Latin shield or the Trinitarian shield, and how does that? What's the connection there, and then how does that lead to your thesis on alchemy in the West?
Yes, the Trinitarian shield, it could be overstated, the importance of it. It's just the Trinitarian shield was found in many manuscripts of the West, and what it is it's an emblem that shows a knight's shield. Right. And it has it's a triangular formation of three circles, which has Father, Son, and Holy Spirit written in it. And then the central circle, the fourth one, just says God or Deus. And it's a nice illustration of how, in the Augustinian perception of things, that there seems to be a subordination of persons, where you have a lot of times in the Trinitarian shield, the Holy Spirit will be at the bottom, and then the Father and Son will be at the top. Not every time, but at any rate, it seems to indicate, if you look at Augustine's theology, he will say that the Holy Spirit is the bond of love between the Father and the Son. Right. For the Orthodox, it's like, well, you can't really mix and match the properties of the persons, like the fact that the Father is the Father. Yeah. The Son, the Holy Spirit is the Holy Spirit. Augustine liked to do things like, well, the Holy Spirit is holy, but so is the Father. The Holy Spirit is a spirit, but so is the Son and the Father. Mm-hmm. He moved on from that to say, well, all of the different properties can be interchanged. Right. Even though he wanted to stop at certain points. And what that led to is a kind of blending of everything into just this radical simple essence. And
it's important to say as well that his progeny with Aquinas, Anselm, they will also agree that the divine nature is interchangeable with any of the divine persons.
Exactly. And that's one thing that I first read from Joseph P. Farrell's unpublished God History and Dialectic, kind of a cult classic for a lot of Orthodox converts. Mm-hmm. And I'm definitely influenced by it. But you can get those interpretations elsewhere, but his formulation of them is kind of pops. It's kind of nice. Mm-hmm. But just the way that Farrell stitches all the sources together and the forcefulness of his logic makes it a really good read.
So how does that lead to your conclusion on alchemy?
Well, because what I argue in Anatomyzing Divinity is that the logic that's behind the Trinitarian shield, what we were just discussing about the Trinity, right? The fact that you can look at this middle term of attributes, and you can use it to reduce everything to a unity. You can basically eliminate all differences within this self-contained Trinity.
Right.
Well, it's very much like the esoteric paradigm for how the alchemist works, how the alchemist does his great work. Because the alchemist begins with the four elements and the properties, the different properties, hot, cold, wet, and dry, as many alchemists look at them. And they're able to work upon this idea that the process of differentiation whereby everything begins in a oneness, a prime matter, and then at the other end of the spectrum we have all these different beings that have their own existence, that are mixtures of all the elements. Well, the alchemist works under the presupposition that it's all reversible.
Yes.
That you can run the process backwards, back to prime matter. If you do that, then you're able to make things happen, and you're able to kind of be a creator yourself, and a divine creator at that.
What do you think about this? I know I didn't include this in your list of questions, but it pops into my head in Michael Hoffman's book, Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. I don't know if you've read that, but he has a discussion on the idea of nuclear technology, or particularly nuclear detonation, that was a sort of reverse alchemy where the goal was to destroy prima materia to then sort of let loose a new creation through chaos. Now, that might be arguable or debatable, but what I think you're absolutely correct on is that this process of viewing God in this method in the West, where God is a sort of, in other words, I think it almost leads to this Augustinian view, although Augustine didn't have this in mind necessarily, but this view leads to the idea that God is almost a kind of technology at work in the universe, and that man can, through his reason or through his gnosis, tap into the techne of what is the divine essence or the divine nature, re-engineer it, and then sort of bring about techno-utopia, or perhaps a techno-dystopia.
Sure. I think there's a grain of truth to all that, because I think what we get with the unfolding of geopolitics in the last century is, obviously, we do get people just take the Cold War for granted, as if it's just, well, that's what happened, and it's just something that is bound to happen. But it's not, because it's the first time in history that people's consciousness was filled up with this idea of physical annihilation and actual Holocaust worldwide that doesn't have anything to do with God. It does. Don't get me wrong. Of course, you did have the preachers and all the people who, followed the McCarthy message and all that stuff. I'm not denying that, but I'm saying that it didn't necessarily have to be, let's look in the sky and see if Jesus is coming back, and let's hope we're doing good. It's more the entire biosphere could be obliterated.
I'm thinking of Oppenheimer when he says, when he quotes the Bhagavad Gita, and he says, "I've become the destroyer of worlds." And so, what I'm getting at is, do you see? Do you agree with what I'm saying about, or not? Which is fine if not. I'm curious to know your view on this. Do you actually see the trek of the West as being, in a way, the result of this view of God as a kind of technology? And because when I say it that way, what I'm talking about is in the alchemical view, you can, if you look at somebody like John Dee, you can tap into these forces through science, quote unquote, or through gnosis, ultimately, for the purpose of re-engineering the created world, for the purpose of immortality, or whatever you're after. In other words, does God become subordinated in this view to almost like a sort of grand divine computer that we can tap into?
I think so, and I think specifically Dee is a good place to look, because Dee combines the international spycraft thing. A lot of people don't realize that the 007 comes from John Dee.
Right.
And basically, Queen Elizabeth I had a minister named John Dee, who lived from 1527 to the early 1600s, who was known as His Majesty's intelligencer. He would go from country to country spying for Elizabeth, according to Richard Deacon, the great scholar of the history of spycraft.
Mm-hmm.
He marshals forth a lot of evidence for that. Well, so Dee served as a spy for Queen Elizabeth, and for both of them, I think spycraft and mysticism sort of were one thing, because let us not forget that by the time you get to the Protestant Reformation, you have rulers who are anti-papal rulers, like
right.
the King or Queen of England, who start to take on this kind of reformist mysticism, this kind of royal mysticism, which says, well, the papacy has claimed for itself all earthly and spiritual power, and that's just the worst thing in the world. That shows that they're Antichrist. So therefore, what I am, though, since we don't have a pope, and we're not going to have a pope, I'm the ruler of Albion.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to take on and I'm the head of the Anglican Church.
Right.
The true church, according to them. And they're going to take on all these divine characteristics.
Right.
If you look at the Frankish view of the ruler, of the emperor, as Kantorowicz and other people have shown, they actually showed the ruler as sharing in this divine nature, very ambiguously. Like, well, he's kind of consubstantial with Christ in his divine essence. It's a really strange teaching.
Sure.
But what it's trying to express is the fact that from Charlemagne on, the secular ruler, the king of the Franks, basically controlled all the other lords beneath him, and then also all the prelates too. So it was kind of a reality that was later expressed in the iconography, which showed the Frankish king or the
right.
Ottonian king with his head going through the border of the icon, if you want to call it an icon. But I think what happens with Dee and with Elizabeth is they've got all these well-balanced Catholic powers on one side and all these other divided Protestant powers on the other. And they're all believe that they're fighting this final war for the Antichrist versus the kind of Protestant
mm-hmm.
Mystical leader.
Right.
And I believe, and I've just written a thing on it, but it's probably not going to be published for a while, but I do believe I have a theory about the 007 and its origin. I think it's because John Dee was very interested in Kabbalah.
Right.
And there's a Kabbalistic theory, and he was also interested in mirrors. And he believed that with magnifying lenses, basically, that you could capture these complexions or these influences from the astral realm, and you could
right.
concentrate. And you could actually change people's minds, and you could change their personalities with these mirrors. One of his heroes was Roger Bacon,
right.
who actually wrote a book importuning the Pope of the time to set up these huge mirrors at strategic points pointed toward the east so that you could do crowd control. So that Roger Bacon even says, these men are rebellious, but if you focus these complexions, as he called them, on these peoples, then you can make them good for work and docile, and they will not be rebellious. And basically, I think Dee is enamored with this idea. He loves Roger Bacon. He's constantly experimenting with optics. Many people think the 007 is the two eyes of John Dee, like eyeglasses or two lenses. I tend to be of the opinion that the two zeros are two mirrors placed one after the other to show that man, you don't just set up the mirror and God does it all by shining the light. As a almost like divine magus of a man, you put one mirror in front of the conical light. The cone of divine light would be the 7, which begins with a point and then splays toward the two zeros.
Mm-hmm.
You put one mirror in front of it, and the divine light shines through it. Well, you put the second one through it, and it even concentrates it even more. I could be wrong. I could be right about that, but I did find some diagrams from some Kabbalistic manuscripts that look really close to the 007 as Dee wrote it as his signature in his correspondence.
That's fascinating. I mean, of course, 7 would have to do with, in the Hebrew, the 7 is also the covenant. So when the Hebrew word is used for the covenant, Bereshit, it is to 7 a thing. So yeah, I'm not necessarily having some big conclusion on that. I'm just thinking that there's no telling what Dee might have read into that. But it would, of course, the covenant would relate to, well, in Jewish theology, there would be God's sort of general covenant with creation in Genesis and with Adam, and then successive covenants that take place with Noah and with Abraham and Moses and David. So you would have essentially the relation of the divine to humanity through those covenantal heads, if you will. So possibly the 7 in Kabbalistic theology would relate to that. And Dee, of course, being part of that mystical imperium, would see Elizabeth and the English people as the mystical body of God, as well, as you mentioned. So, but that's fascinating. I didn't know anything. I mean, I knew that Dee had an interest in spy glasses and so forth, which would make sense with being a spy and with optics. And
plus, Roger Bacon is one of the first people to ever create a pair of eyeglasses.
Right. Interesting.
So that's another connection. And another thing to keep in mind is that John Dee, I've done quite a bit on John Dee, and I believe it's pretty clear that he had a Kabbalistic theory of what I call spiritual optics, whereby God created the universe as a single body of light. And this body is, in some sense, a huge luminous man. That's the unity of it.
Right.
And it's Adam Kadmon is what that's called, and
right.
It's also the tree of life, the Sephirot, in Kabbalah.
Right.
And the counterpart to this Adamic man of light, you might call him, is the light or fire God placed in people's eyes, in human beings' eyes. This is what Dee thinks. And
right.
This optics of Dee allows the human soul to be directly and sensuously united with this astral light in this universal body of light. I have read a lot of the poems and a lot of the writings that came out of the Elizabethan circle that Dee was in. And I'm of the belief that this mysticism was held by Edmund Spencer. It was held by Elizabeth herself. She calls herself, or she's called Astrea. There's the book by Francis Yates called Astrea, which is Virgo, the constellation Virgo, in Greek and Roman mythology. And she saw herself, I think, as an avatar or a manifestation of this divine body of light. Well, how is it that she's a woman? Well, the whole idea of Adam Kadmon is that he doesn't need a mate,
right,
because he's already a complete man. He's
right.
man and woman.
Both genders, right.
So basically, there seems to be, I've looked at the poems, I don't obviously have all the individual citations at hand, but there seems to be this idea that there's this body of light which somehow equals all Englishmen, that the destiny of all these English adepts is to unite chastely but corporeally with this body of light, which seems to be identified with Astrea as Elizabeth. So I think that there's this idea, there's a weird kind of, you know as well as I do with all the spy books you've read and all the ones I've read, there's this strange Britannia-type mysticism where spies and other officials will basically sacrifice themselves for the crown.
Right.
And we even have Aleister Crowley. I just read the book Secret Agent 666. Right. Where Crowley, turns out, was an ultra-Tory his entire life. And apparently was trained for spycraft by
British intelligence.
At Cambridge University.
Right.
He was apparently sponsored by Robert Cecil, who became Prime Minister, and who was an ultra-Tory. He said that every action he takes in his life that benefits the crown, he said, it brings me closer to England. And I don't think anything that Crowley ever said didn't have, some kind of mystical meaning. He certainly wouldn't have invested that much, fanaticism and that much attention on anything that didn't have some connection to his his mystical ideas, his magical ideas.
That's fascinating because in the grad classes that I had on Renaissance stuff, and I'm sure you're far more well studied than I am in that field, but I did have a really good class on the Fairy Queen, and a lot of what is in the Fairy Queen matches up precisely to what you're discussing. Particularly the different books that deal with, not just Red Cross Knight, but even more like highly esoteric, difficult to decipher sections where he discusses transmigration of souls, and Spencer presents a really weird view of Eden, and basically the summation of the text is, of course, that Britannia is the successor to the Roman Empire, right? So you have this Virgil writes the Aeneid that is the complement to Homer's works, arguing that Rome takes over from the Greeks, and then Spencer's job was to present the mythos for Britannia that the Fairy Queen, who is, of course, Elizabeth, is the summation of all these mysteries as well. So I would not be surprised if you're absolutely correct, particularly given someone like Spencer. But I also think that you can look at two other philosophers of that time, because we see a shift in around that same period from what I guess we might call the ancient or medieval view of the world and of man, the great chain of being. We see a shift towards a sort of popular rationalism in people like Descartes. And Descartes has this same fascination with optics, and there's actually a lot of evidence and books have been written on Descartes' association with various esoteric societies. Anyway, point being, it's almost as if a shift occurs where there's the Hermetic and alchemical stuff that might have been more openly discussed and written about from in the Augustinian times up. I'm including Augustine's view of the Trinity as something alchemical and esoteric, to where by the time we come to the Enlightenment, this stuff sort of goes underground and does seem to be very much the property of the circles of the Royal Society, if you will, by the time we get to Newton and people like that. What do you think about that?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, here's what really gives instant validity to all those claims, in my mind, is that in the Frankish church councils, namely Council of Frankfurt, 794, the Franks at that point, besides declaring all the Greek-speaking Christians to be a bunch of Greek heretics, that's quote, Greek heretics, at that council, Charlemagne actually, and his court theologians obviously helped him draft this, but he put forth a new concept of images, which was heavily indebted to all the emblematic things we were talking about with Augustine.
Right.
And in this theory of images, he declared that religious images in churches and in public and private spaces should not be venerated or kissed, and that was the main Christian practice, I would argue, for at least large swaths of Christianity for many centuries. But Charlemagne thought that they should rather only be seen. They should be contemplated and viewed. Icons should be read by simply looking at them. And that sounds exactly like the emblematic doctrine. And don't forget, in the Middle Ages after this, there would be this ocular piety, where you look at the monstrance and you look at the tasteless, colorless bread.
Yes.
And also you look at relics and reliquaries, which have body parts in them, and you don't necessarily have contact with them. You simply have to intuit them by looking at the image, and it enters into your mind,
right,
your intellect. Well, this new doctrine of what we might call optical mysticism has interesting implications, I think, for royal religion in England and everyone, not just England. I mean, all of Europe is under the sway of this kind of thinking. Mm-hmm. And the writer who drafted what's called the Caroline books, which were presented at the Council of Frankfurt as a refutation of the way icons were viewed, religious images were viewed. They taught that man-made images were signs that could, quote, provoke the viewer to think of the image's prototype as it is in its own right outside of artistic representation. And they liked the cross because you could contemplate this form of the cross, which they thought was actually in heaven. The cross is up there. But they didn't like other images that were crafted by artisans. I would argue because they weren't Frankish bishops, could be other people that were crafting them.
Yeah.
But they only said, well, images are contemplated so that people get a provocation in their own, the theater inside their head, the little viewing screen, the internal space that Augustine invented.
Yes.
You are able to work these things out, and that gives somebody something to do when they're needing to keep people away from, the true, the type of theology that might get them to question the fact that they should just simply work all the time for the Franks. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is that this idea of the images, when it gets to the point of the Renaissance, the 1600s, you have John Dee who's specifically saying what the whole point of knowledge, the whole point of this natural philosophy, is to take an image that is beamed into our head from divine influences and to duplicate it in other consciences, in other minds. If you think about that, in the language I just quoted from the Council of Frankfurt, to provoke someone, and then you think about Roger Bacon, how he says Roger Bacon even said, if there are people who are hiding in a city or even underground, we can use these influences to tell where they are. So it's the kind of stuff they're doing in the Middle East right now. It's
it's like DARPA and Skynet, satellites that can basically spy on everything that are linked into supercomputers that store all the data.
So that idea, it may sound really grandiose to say this, but that's everything I say. So people better get used to it, I guess.
Well, I mean, it's these grandiose ideas that produce people that actually build these very things. Now, I'm not saying that means that all the esoteric philosophy and bizarre alchemy that they adhere to is right, but what I'm saying is that you're absolutely correct that this is the worldview or the thinking of the people who do these very things.
Yes, it's a good point to make for people who are skeptical and who are more cautious in their historiography. All we have to prove is that people had the intention of controlling entire nations of people through technology, and
Absolutely.
We do have that.
Right.
And not only are these people aren't obscure individuals. They're people who have the ear of the Pope. They're people who have the ear of the Crown of England.
Right. So that's an interesting. Let me ask you this question then. So because you segued perfectly into all the areas where I was going to go. You've actually answered the next question. What is the relationship between espionage and esotericism? You gave a perfect answer to that. So how then do you now see the relationship between something like, say, the papacy and, say, the British Crown? Do you see a connection between those things? Does this go back to that Franco-Papal Monarchy? Or is there no connection? Is that tenuous? What do you think?
No, I mean, there's a complete connection. I mean, if you read all the poems that, even the Fairy Queen, which has different, in my understanding, there are different figures that allegorically represent the whore of Babylon, and they allegorically represent the papacy and all that it stands for. There's even one poem that talks about the divine light that comes down in these cones. John Dee always presented them as cones, which is where I came up with the 007 interpretation.
Right.
But there's even a poem of an anonymous courtier of Elizabeth that says that when she comes back, when Estrella comes back, then it's going to be great for the people that are for Britannia, but it's going to be really horrible for all those Spaniards because there's going to be a comet. It's going to be a cone, all right, but it's going to be a comet, and it's going to. They're burning in their lust, and they live their lives in keeping with the lowest, basest form of eroticism, unlike the high, chaste eroticism of the Virgin Queen. So they're all going to burn here and now. They're going to be incinerated, is what the poem seems to say. So yeah, I do think about that though. She is defining herself, or at least those who are speaking for her, the courtiers, are defining her always in contradistinction to the papacy, which is the antithesis of everything that should be. Now, ironically, as we know, this thing has a history before Elizabeth. You have centuries of Frankish kings and emperors and liege lords who are telling the Pope, no, you can't come into my country and take over my power. I'm going to expel you.
Right.
We know that the Gallican Church, the French Church, have always been really, iffy about the papacy. Like, we follow the papacy, but you just stay out of our country.
That's still manifested in the Society of St. Pius X to this day with Lefebvre, right?
Yeah, and think about it. Even in France, after the early 1800s, where you have Napoleon dismissing all these bishops and they go overseas, and then all of a sudden they come back, and then the people are like, there were 12 bishops appointed by Napoleon with the Concordat directly with the Pope, and I think 1804, it was the early 1800s. But the people in the countryside of France were like, well, we don't accept these new bishops. We're still going to follow the ones that are in other countries that left.
Mm-hmm.
So this church is an apostate church, and that's where a lot of the wandering bishops and the weird spin-off jurisdictions. One branch of them is called the Valette, succession,
mm-hmm.
comes from these, it's called the Petite Église, or the little church.
Right.
They're like, well, we don't accept, you can't just make up bishops between Napoleon and the Pope. We already have bishops. You just ran them out of the country. So we follow them, and we don't have a bishop now, but we're fine, and what you call the Catholic Church is not the Catholic Church, and they kind of became their own line, and they're still around.
Right.
But the thing about it is you have these power struggles between the Pope. Everyone who is not the Pope is saying, well, I have all this power, and I control these bishops and these lords, and I have this chrism. It's a Frankish tradition that this uncreated chrism from the holy ampoule is put on my head. So I have this kind of like semi-divine status. So I'm kind of like a pope myself. So you just, stay down in Italy and be what you are, be the head of Christendom, but stay out of my country. So you have this, everyone looking at the Pope as, well, he's the guy that says he has all the power, and no one can in any way go against his power, and that's what I aspire to be. So there's a tendency to use the language, to use the kind of insignia, and to use all the whole semantic field that goes around the papacy to kind of buttress your own claim as a ruler. And so that happens all through the centuries.
Right, so it's sort of like just a dialectical foil to it that takes on all the same claims.
Yeah, and of course, as you said, it's a dialectic. So there are always these other elements that are being mixed into the fudge bowl, if you will. Yeah.
Well, and also you bring up an interesting point with wandering bishops. I mean, from my research, not just necessarily with wandering bishops, but with all these different religious sects and sectarians and splits and schisms and national churches and so forth, state churches. From my research, these are, of course, hotbeds of espionage because, as you know, such circles would, of course, provide excellent cover for secret information. So, that's my understanding of the connection between those two. Do you see, though, for example, I'm reading through Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, and he discusses in one section in the 17th century and 18th century a connection between, say, the Rothschild banking empire that takes over the Vatican bank finances. And so there begins to be a sort of merger in that period between sort of British Zionist interests, or what will eventually become Zionism, and a sort of backdoor connection to the papacy. Now, I'm not trying to necessarily read too much into that, but I guess what I'm getting at is, do you see any possible connection then between the crown and the papacy, or is it In other words, is there possibly a sort of union that's secretly there, or is it an actual sort of, we're going to fight you because you're the Pope?
I think that, of course, now, I mean, what's the British Crown now?
Right.
I mean, it's not really what it used to be in terms of, a real king who's able to...
Well, let me put it like this. The City of London, okay, the sort of the private corporate city that does, in a sense, include the Crown as part of the establishment. But let's just say then the City of London.
Oh, yeah. You have Philo-Hellenism on the British Isles that goes back really far. And you have, Oliver Cromwell, who the Jews were expelled from England.
Right.
So Oliver Cromwell brought them back. Oliver Cromwell also was a Philo-Hellenist who had certain views about the fact that English Christianity goes back to Glastonbury.
Right.
It goes back to this, the Blake poem Jerusalem, where Jesus Christ walks on the land. However, did he walk on it in the form of a lamb or a human? It's weird.
Yeah.
But it's because you're on a green meadow. You would expect a lamb to be there, and he says it's the lamb. So, is this another one of those weird emblematic manifestations of Augustine, or what? But anyway, what you have with Jerusalem is this idea that there's an original Christianity. It's before any of the ecumenical councils. It's before all the papal stuff or the Orthodox stuff, because Jesus and Joseph of Arimathea came directly to England.
The British Israelite story, right?
Absolutely. So that's there as kind of the backdrop, and then you have the actual invitation: come over here and help us with our economic infrastructure, because who knows who we're going to have, what Catholic power we're going to have to fight in the future, or any other power for that matter. And so you do have this conscious Helen is how would you say it? Like a Philo-Judaism is what I meant to say. I said Philo-Hellenism, but the reason why I was confused is because, as you know, way back when the city of Alexandria became very Judaic, lots of Jews are in Alexandria. Right. So Hellenism as a Greek, Greek / syncretistic view that goes everywhere, begins in Alexandria, and there are a lot of Jews there, a lot of them involved in, obviously, financial matters.
Sure.
So, Philo-Hebraism is what I was trying to say. That's the backdrop in England. And so, when you actually have the Jews being invited back and said, do your thing, help buttress our economy, and don't forget, in the late 1800s, Benjamin Disraeli is the prime minister.
Prime minister, right.
There's an occult group called the Primrose League, which was a lot of people involved in the Primrose League. One person that was involved in it was Aleister Crowley's family. Aleister Crowley's family owned this big brewery, and there's a particular county in England that they were pretty much one of the major economic players in. Well, this county happened to be where some friends of Robert Cecil resided on manors in this county, and they were all friends. Aleister Crowley's aunt, who was one of the major influences on his life, she was a Primrose League member. The whole idea of the Primrose League was Benjamin Disraeli loved the Primrose, supposedly. So since he had just died, all the ultra-Tories, all the people that believed in this mystical kind of monarchy thing, all banded together and said, we're going to have a paramasonic society, actually based in some of its details on the Orange Order, and we all know what that, what they're all about. So you have Crowley and all these types of people who are involved in the Primrose League, and it's all based on the fact that the greatest prime minister that the English crown has ever had, the greatest helpmeet, for the Queen, was Benjamin Disraeli, the Jewish banker, and he's a guy who brokered a multi-million-pound deal over the Suez Canal. I'm not sure anybody else besides him and his connections and his status, as an international super financial Jewish figure, could have done that. Is that good or bad? I don't have any commentary on it. Where my negative interpretation of Judaic culture comes in, which it's not Judaic culture as a whole, is some of the ways that Kabbalah are interpreted are absolutely, to me, always around every time something nefarious is happening. Now, there may be some Kabbalah scholars who are like, well, that's not real Kabbalah. I'm fine with that because I haven't studied Hebrew and I haven't spent 20 years, going through the Zohar. So I don't claim to be a Kabbalah scholar. All I can say is the stuff that I have studied in the Renaissance. Whenever it seems to get weird, erotically and in any other sense of the word, there seems to be some kind of Kabbalistic thing involved in it. Now, what conclusions I can draw from that, that's up to me to prove it in the pudding of my books and articles.
And of course I don't claim to be an expert on any of that either, but I guess what I was curious about, though, was I was going to segue into the Cold War, and I guess I wanted to get your take on the relationship of the papacy and the crown and the West to the Cold War, because as you said a minute ago, we can't overlook the Cold War. So I'm curious to know, for example, in 1988-89, there was I wrote an article about what Malachi Martin discusses at length in his book, Keys of This Blood, where there was a meeting between Bush Sr., Gorbachev, and the Pope. Now, the first, it wasn't all at the same time. Originally, it was the Pope met with Bush Sr. on Malta, and then I think the day before that, Gorbachev met with the Pope in Rome. So, or it was all in Malta, and it was the day. Anyway, this all happened within the span of a couple of days in 1988, 89, right at the end of the year, and this sort of supposedly marked, the quote end of the Cold War. So, out of curiosity, what is your take on the Cold War, and what is your take on the relationship of these three powerful entities? What Malachi Martin calls the transnationalists being the sort of the Western capitalists, the internationalists being the sort of the Soviet communist-minded group, and then the Roman papal interest.
Well, you probably know more than I do about that. I haven't specifically. I've studied Cold War a little bit, but my focus on the Cold War actually was I was looking more at new religious movements during the Cold War. I wanted to write a chapter that focused on that, so I looked at certain religious things in America, mainly, that came out of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And that's how I kind of came to grips with some of the more not so obvious aspects of the Cold War. As far as like Malta and Gorbachev and all of that, I wouldn't have any insights that you don't already have, I think, about that. But in a general sense, I can say that history of the 20th century, they're strange bedfellows. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is money rules it all.
Right.
That's what I think. Why? It's pretty obvious. Everything's built on consensus. There are no empires that are primarily. You don't have the Roman Empire like in the 5th century where they began to weed out anybody that wasn't an Orthodox Christian. Is that a good or bad thing? I'm just describing what happened.
Right.
What you have now, as we all know, we have this intensive stratification of society where, because everything's done by computers, everything's done in this international digital banking realm.
Right.
You have all these crazy decisions being made by a small group of people. This leads to conspiracy theories, which I think should be looked at. Mm-hmm. But I think that even if none of the conspiracy theories are true, it's very structured as conspiratorial.
Right.
It's very structured is, like the term cabal in the English language comes from Kabbalah. In the 1600s or even before, people were like, well, there's this cabal, they're meeting at this ale house. You have to do these secret handshakes and they won't let anybody in unless you join.
Right.
It's a cabal. And little did they know, they were absolutely right. They were interested in Kabbalah, most of those Masonic and Paramasonic groups. But what you have now, though, is you do have a cabal now. Are they into Kabbalah? Well, I don't know. But I do know that the fates of nations are obviously, it's cliche, but it's true, are being decided, and the agendas and what's being said what's being decided are unknown by most people.
Right.
It creates unbelievable anxiety. I think it's something like the Cold War, but now
right.
it's just economic policies instead of bombs are what people fear.
Right, but it's
economic plans.
And it's not. Well, do you still see it as East versus West, or do you see it as sort of maybe global elite versus the rest of the world?
Well, I think basically it's hard to avoid the conclusion that there is a global elite. They have to put forth a certain image to their constituencies. They have to make it look right, and I think that same. If you're a global banker from Eastern Europe, and you're from Austria or something, and then you're also a banker from New York or London, you have the same kind of interest, and you have the same things, the same no-nos go across the board. You have to make it palatable, and with globalization and with everyone like copying on to this American culture thing, where it's like we lead the way,
right?
That Europe's a close second, and everybody else is just jumping on board, trying to grab whatever scraps they can to say, hey, I'm on track too. I'm in Thailand, but I'm modern. I have all the gadgets that everyone else has, and mine only cost $12, and yours costs $200. So you do have, whether it's conspiratorial or just the way things are, you do have a group of people whose interests are, keeping the plan going, whatever that plan may be. And no one rocks the boat too much.
Right.
And beyond that, the simple fact that we don't know any more than that is what causes the anxiety. And there wasn't such an arrangement in the past, although Tragedy and Hope certainly talks about, the London axis.
Absolutely.
And it's scary, some of the stuff that he comes up with.
Well, let me ask you this. My research, I did a lot of research on Fleming and Bond. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, or if that's an interest of you. I know you said that you've mentioned before Graham Greene, and you talked about spy fiction. Just out of curiosity, how do you think spy fiction relates to the stuff that we've talked about?
Well, it's interesting. Graham Greene was a spy. Also, John le Carré was a spy.
Right.
So was Ian Fleming. So was Roald Dahl, the Charlie and Chocolate Factory guy.
Right.
They're all out there. And it makes you want to look at their work. But I also read something somewhere that said, don't believe any of the memoirs of an ex-spy, because they're all going to be, it's like, well, taking that and running with it, I think that what most people do, what John le Carré or Graham Greene has to offer the person on the street is an analysis of the psychological side of it.
Right.
I think that
good point.
Like John le Carré, he doesn't have to tell us what's really going on in the Middle East. What John le Carré can tell us from his own experience of being a young Cambridge or Oxford student, I forget where he went, I think Cambridge, and being recruited by these, by people that did have that Ian Fleming sparkle.
Right.
That you have a mission. It's beyond, it's secretive. It allows you to do things you normally wouldn't be able to do in society, but it's so important, and it's going to mean the destiny of the world. Are you up for this mission?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for a certain type of personality, like John le Carré said, I felt that I had found my vocation for the first time in my life, and everything in my life had meaning. Then he became disillusioned, but still, it's very interesting to show how, for me, it illustrates how spycraft works, because those tactics that the spies use to get other spies to join are not probably that far off from what spies use to get information.
Bingo. Yep.
To do so, you can't really approach it in a straightforward manner, or else I think you'll come to jump to conclusions. But if you look at it as a presentation of a way of thinking, almost you have to approach it gnostically in a weird way, then I think you can get a lot of insight out of that fiction. Well,
my analysis was based on actually, it's very similar, oddly enough, to what you were discussing with the Augustinian view of images. Now, of course, I had not thought about the connection that you made between the Augustinian view of images and how this sort of runs its train up through John Dee and what John Dee discusses. But there is a parallel there between when a person writes fiction. They are, in a sense, writing a kind of propaganda, and so you are, from the perspective of semiotics, you're manipulating images to put something out there in the world to achieve a certain effect. And so there's a direct connection, or sort of a circular symbiotic relationship, if you will, between someone, say, like Ian Fleming, who would write his Bond stories based on actual covert operations that did happen. Now, of course, I'm not saying that everything in the Bond story is historic. Obviously, that's not true, but they are based on real operations. And so what happens then is that the fiction then enters into the world, into the market, and becomes propaganda. So there's a circular relationship between the real historical event that then becomes fiction, that then becomes an actual event. And point being is that it becomes a kind of propaganda, or what we might call another form of psychological warfare. So I'm curious to know, from your perspective, what you've researched, do you see a connection between these things, mass media, manipulation of symbols and semiotics, and psychological warfare?
I think I do. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking about that, about how the books I've read about the inside the JFK White House, with JFK and RFK talking about, trying to get Cuba, trying to kill Castro. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that it seems that, it doesn't seem, it's a certainty that JFK and perhaps even RFK habitually read spy novels, especially Ian Fleming.
Yes, he did. Right.
And, JFK was an absolute peak of excitement when he got to meet the spy that caught Kim Philby. I can't remember the spy's name, but he was going to have one of these Bay of Pigs type operations on this Operation Paperclip or Mongoose. I forget. It's not Paperclip, it's Mongoose.
Right.
But when he actually met this guy in the corridors of the White House, he's like, "So you're our James Bond, are you?" And this guy, the spy that caught Kim Philby, had these two 6-shooters that he had on either side. He looked like a cowboy, kind of, with ivory handles.
Wow. Well,
he's really Gnostic.
Have you read Spycatcher by Peter Wright?
I haven't. No, I haven't had that pleasure yet.
That's good. You would like that, because it deals with what you're talking about. But now, this has been a fascinating talk. I don't want to cut you off. If you've got any other thoughts that you want to share, go ahead. But we probably should draw it to a close here, because we could talk all day about this. And so I'd like to have you back eventually to discuss more. But what are you working on presently? Can we expect a new book from you? And then where can we find your work?
Yeah, I'm working on all kinds of things right now. I published an article called Doxophysics. We didn't talk about anything that's in my Doxophysics article. It's completely something I haven't gone into before. It's more about the ancient teachings about the human soul, and some original research I've done on that.
Well, that sounds great.
That came out in... Pardon?
I said that sounds great.
Yeah, I think I sent you a copy of it,
right.
Like your eyes only kind of copy.
Yeah, that's why I didn't mention it. I didn't want to.
Well, we already pretty much ran the gamut through a lot of stuff, so I don't think we shortchanged anybody. But yeah, I worked on the Doxophysics. It was published in a journal called 46M Shadow Culture, and that's available at 46m.org. It's a small publishing company.
Okay.
That's a friend of mine operates, and so that can be purchased there. As far as books, well, I've written an entire book that is unpublished at the moment, but it took 2 years to write it. It's called Anthropos. Mm-hmm. I took 2 years to write it, but looking back on it, I do believe that it's not really where I want it to be. It's not something that I want to put my name on as of yet. It's more of a transitional work that's led me to what I'm doing now. So as far as a book from me, well, hopefully within a year or so we'll have something else in the hopper as far as the book-length project.
Excellent.
Right now, I'm just writing articles and exploring various topics.
Okay. And, of course, there is Anatomyzing Divinity, and what's the best place to get a hold of that?
Amazon.com
Okay.
is a good place to order that. You can get the cheapest price by comparing the different sellers, obviously. And then also my other book, Realism of Glory, is there. I also did a translation. It was put out by Synaxis Press of The Life in Christ. It's a short treatise by Father John Romanides. That right now is out of print, but I think someone stuck it up on the internet for free. So if you want to just look up James Kelley, Romanides' Life in Christ, it has an introduction, and then it has a translation done by myself.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate it, James. I really do. You've given us a lot of meat to chew on here, so this is excellent.
Well, I've gained a lot from our friendship over the years, and I see it continuing on into the future.
All right. Well, thank you. And like I said, listeners can check out his work, Anatomyzing Divinity. You can buy that at Amazon. And is there a website where there might be any of your articles?
Website with my articles is not up right now. That's a good idea, though. I'm going to get on that. Hopefully, within the next year, I'll have a website with various articles and translations and things.
Excellent.
Like that for people to grab.
Well, thank you, James, and come back and we'll talk again soon.
Okay, Jay. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Bye.